Shalom. The subject of this short video has to do with Resurrection Day and the feast called Weeks or Pentecost. And there's an inherent relationship between these 2 days. Now, the question that we have to ask is this: how do we know when to begin the count? Because biblically, and I'm speaking about a specific passage of Scripture, if you look sometime to Leviticus chapter 23, we have there the appointed days of the Lord. Now, these appointed days, some are festivals, one is Shabbat, and there are others which are called high Shabbats, which are days which no work can be done. They're treated just like a Shabbat, regardless of what day of the week these days fall upon. And there's some of these special days that are not festivals. They are not treated as high Shabbats or Shabbats, but there is a special observance for it. And I want to begin by talking about Resurrection Day. When we look at the scripture, and again, all of this is found in Leviticus chapter 23, verses 9 through 16, so you can look there yourself. But when we examine that scripture, we find a very important phrase. And that phrase is this: Macharat HaShabbat. Now, that term, Macharat HaShabbat, means the day after Shabbat. The question is this: what Shabbat are we referring to? If you go along with rabbinical Judaism, they will say the Shabbat that is being spoken of is the high Shabbat of the first day of unleavened bread. It is treated as a special high Shabbat. Now, that 15th day of the first day of unleavened bread is not what we should be thinking of in regard to this term. And why is that? Because we find out later on in this same passage, and again, Leviticus chapter 23, verses 9 through 16, it tells us that we are to count 7 Shabbats. Now, one time that word Shabbat can mean a week, a 7-day period. But we also find that that term Shabbat, when we rightly understand it, it means the normal 7th-day Shabbat. And therefore, Resurrection Day, because it's the day after, not the high Shabbat, but as we're going to see, the normal 7th-day Shabbat. Therefore, Resurrection Day has to be on a Sunday. And what do? Well, we count 7 full weeks. And if you do that, 7 times 7, 49. And the day after the 7th Shabbat, which is the 7th weekly Shabbat, that 7th-day Shabbat, is going to be the 50th day, or Pentecost, or what we read in the Hebrew Bible, the Feast of Weeks. So what we find here is a very simple formula, and I want to go over it because rabbinical Judaism gets it wrong. And the reason why I say it is very simple. They say that term, Mi Macharat HaShabbat, from the day after the Sabbath, they say that is the high Sabbath of the 15th day of Nisan, the first month of the biblical calendar. This cannot be for 2 reasons. First of all, if it was the day after the 15th, it would be fixed as the 16th day of Nisan. That's what Judaism teaches, but it can't be right. Why? For 2 reasons. First of all, no calendar date is given. When we look at other festivals, we have calendar dates. But in regard to Resurrection Day and the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost, there are no calendar dates given. Therefore, it should not be given by Judaism. The second reason, I already alluded to this, it says that you shall count from the day after the 7th, and if the Judaism is right, it would be the 7th high Shabbat. There are not 7 high Shabbats during this period. There's only the first high Shabbat of the 15th day of Nisan, and when the Feast of Unleavened Bread concludes, it concludes on another high Shabbat. So there's 2. This does not meet the biblical criteria. So there's not 7 high Shabbats, which tells us the term Shabbat has to be the 7th day, that weekly Shabbat, or what we call in English a Saturday, which means the day after that would have to be a Sunday. And when we examine the scripture, we see that Messiah rose from the dead on the first day of the week. That is a biblical fact. And what do? Well, the scripture says from the day after that weekly Sabbath, so it has to be a Sunday, we count 7 full weeks, and therefore we do so. 7 times 7 is 49, and the day after would be the 50th day. And therefore, here's the formula. Let's get to the conclusion. In order to understand when is Resurrection Day, all we do is this. We come to the 15th day of Nisan, then we wait until the normal 7th day Shabbat, the typical weekly Shabbat, a Saturday. And the next day would be Resurrection Day. And therefore, what do we do after that? On Resurrection Day, which is the beginning of that counting period, and we count 7 full weeks, and the next day, or 50 days, would be the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost, which is simply the Greek term for 50. So it's very simple. You go to the first high Shabbat, which is the 15th day of the first month. Then you wait until the typical 7th day Shabbat, and the next day would be Resurrection Day. You count 7 full weeks, or 49 days, and the next day would be Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks. So this is how you do it. Now, the typical year that we're talking about this year, in the calendar year in Judaism, 5785. What do we know? We know that the high Shabbat was on a Sunday. Then we have to wait almost another week until 6 full days, and then we have that weekly Shabbat. The next day would be Resurrection Day. Then we wait a total of 50 days. We come again to a first day of the week, or a Sunday, and that would be Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks. So do not make the mistake that because of the year that Messiah was crucified, there was only 3 days and 3 nights before Resurrection Day. That is not always how it is each and every year. For example, this year, there were 6 full days before that Shabbat and before the day after, which would be that first Sunday after the first Shabbat, after that high Shabbat of the 15th day of Nisan. So I hope that clarifies you. And again, the formula is very simple. It works every year. It's not a certain number of days between the crucifixion and the resurrection. It's not fixed, but we follow this formula. We go to the first day of unleavened bread, which is the 15th day of the month. We wait until we come to the typical, normal 7th day Shabbat, the weekly Shabbat, and then the next day is resurrection. We count 7 full weeks, and then the next day, or the 50th day, would be Pentecost. That is how we determine when is Resurrection Day, and 50 days later, when is the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost. I hope this clarifies this issue where there's been much confusion, especially this year. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned until our next video. Until then, shalom from Israel.